Hello and welcome back to Star History Blitz. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and in today's video lesson we're going to be going over abolitionists, and that is people against slavery. During this time in history, we had a lot of reform movements, people who wanted to change society, the injustices that were happening in their lives that they were living, and one of them was this institution of slavery, or this peculiar institution which was known as slavery. And so abolitionists were people who were trying to fight to end slavery, and they all fought in different ways. Some actually fought like through violence, some fought through writing, some fought by helping slaves escape. So let's take a look at some of these individuals in our U.S. history that were abolitionists during this time. Of course, these are some key points that we're going to be going over, specifically some individuals during this time period. So what is the abolitionist movement? As I mentioned, it's an anti, which means against, slavery movement that fought to bring a complete end to slavery. So they were trying to completely stop slavery. Quakers were actually the first abolitionists during the colonial era. They were the first people who tried to end slavery. And the reason why they did this, if you recall Quakers from Pennsylvania, is because it went against their principles, their Christian principles, their religious principles. Remember that Quakers were all about peace, love, God, and equality. And so they were the first who wanted to end slavery. Some other abolitionists were, for example, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This novel influenced many to support the abolitionist movement. When people began to read this book, it actually angered both the North and the South. It angered Northerners because they couldn't believe the injustices that were being made against humans, right? The slaves. And the Southerners were upset because it made them look bad. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe is known for writing this book that really influenced the momentum of the abolitionist movement, meaning people started to join this movement, and it increased the tension between the North and the South. Likewise, you also have William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist man who published a newspaper. So this is how he fought against slavery. He wrote a newspaper called the Liberator. And in this newspaper, he wrote about the injustices of slavery and how slavery was wrong and how it needed to end. Another famous abolitionist was a former slave. His name was Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass actually escaped from slavery, and he knew how to read and write, and he became a famous orator, speaker. I mean, he made speeches about what it was like to be a slave in the South. He even wrote a novel, a book, an autobiography, the personal narrative of Frederick Douglass, where he actually spoke about all the injustices that he suffered. And he was also the author of a newspaper titled The North Star. And the reason why he titled it The North Star was because when slaves would run away, one of the things that they would use to help them get to the North or even Canada was keeping the North Star, the brightest star in the sky, in front of them to lead them to freedom. That's why Frederick Douglass named his newspaper The North Star. Harriet Tubman also became a famous abolitionist. She didn't write, she didn't fight, but she helped slaves escape. She became known as the conductor of the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad was not actually a railroad underground. What the underground part, the reason why they call it underground, is to symbolize that it was a secret. No one was supposed to know the different routes that could be taken to freedom. Only the people who were conducting this, who were the conductors of these railroads. And so conductors basically is the person who's in front of the train. And they knew about the different stations, meaning the different places you can stop, and it was safe for runaway slaves. And so Harriet Tubman saved more than 300 people. And she was wanted. She was known as the Black Moses because she was freeing so many people. Another abolitionist is John Brown. He was known for violence. He said the only way to end slavery is through violence. So he led a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry. And so he's famously known for saying the only way to end slavery is through violence. The last one is Henry David Thoreau. We've already spoken about him. He's a transcendentalist. We talked about him during the Age of Reform. Now, as a transcendentalist, he believed in the individual doing what's right, even if it's wrong. So, for example, he believed that slavery was wrong. And he knew that during this time, the United States of America was collecting taxes to finance the U.S.-Mexican War. So he refused to pay those taxes because he knew that if we won the U.S.-Mexican War, we would get all this land all the way to California. And what that would mean is that slavery was going to spread. And he did not want slavery to spread because he believed slavery was wrong. So the way he fought against slavery was through civil disobedience, meaning he chose not to pay those taxes. He was even put in jail for a night because he refused to pay those taxes that would support the U.S.-Mexican War and eventually lead to the spread of slavery. So again, this is Henry David Thoreau, civil disobedience. Now, all of these abolitionists are basically increasing that tension, that cause for civil war, the North versus the South. There's three causes: slavery, sectionalism, and states' rights. And all these abolitionists are actually contributing to those causes to the point that eventually we do go to war, North versus South. So, for our next video session, we're going to be discussing sectionalism, which is one of the reasons for war. So thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in the next video session. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez.